Welcome to TeamTalk from TeamKinetic with me, Chris Martin.
And me, Imogen, Greatbatch. TeamTalk is the podcast that dives deeper into the world of volunteer management, getting to know the people who help make volunteering happen, why they do it, how they do it, and what they want to see change. If you're new to listening to the podcast, a big warm welcome. If you've listened before, welcome back.
This week, we're joined by Piers Martin, Head of Leadership and Academy at the Premier League and the Chair of UK Deaf Sport.
Big welcome, Piers. Both Chris and I have been a little bit part of your journey, so we're very excited to have you on the podcast talking to us today. Big welcome.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Piers, and I don't think it'd be unfair to say you have quite the CV. When we were sort of writing it out before the podcast, and just to sort of very quickly make people aware of who you are, your jobs have included the Active Alliance, Swim England, British Swimming, Sports Resolution UK, Manchester Metropolitan University, British Basketball, British Bobsleigh, British Table Fencing, British Fencing, the British Olympic Committee, World Academy of Sports. In fact, it might have been quicker to list the places you haven't worked than the places that you have. But what we're hoping is you're going to bring all that sort of leadership knowledge to bear with us today on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm not quite sure how I define myself now. I tend to sort of say I'm a jack of all trades. I'm a joke, not a goat, right? But yeah, there's a long list there. But some of those have been national governing bodies I spent a lot of time working with you both on, and some of those have been national governing bodies, organisations I just had brief touch points with. But my whole life has been wrapped around sport as an athlete first, and then coach, and working for various national governing bodies. So yeah, sport's at the heart of everything I do. We do, right? It's how we met.
Yeah, definitely.
Very, very true.
And that's a really good starting point, Piers, because sort of we really enjoy opening the show with getting to know you, your journey, and understanding the view of volunteering from you, who's been at that board level working with all of those different sports, but has come in from that athlete side of things. So I guess the question is, how has volunteering played a role in your journey, and how has it supported your career journey as well?
I've volunteered pretty much throughout my life, from and the vast majority of that's been around sport. In fact, I can't think of too many things I've done outside of sport, or at least having a connect to sport. Predominantly around volunteer coaching, and now later on in my career in terms of volunteering for board positions, or on subcommittees, or helping out in different ways. I do a lot of volunteer coaching now, exec coaching. They tend to be through sort of charities, but the vast majority is connected to sport. So there's always been that passion that's wrapped around sport as a thing that's at the centre of everything I do in my life. I think, how has it helped my career? They run in parallel. I don't, if I look through my CV or some of the things that you've read out there, Chris, I don't see the difference between the voluntary roles and the paid roles. Sometimes they're just, I try and be professional in both of the things that I do, but all of those connect. Some of those are volunteer roles, some of those are paid roles, but they're all part of everything I do in my career.
I think you're volunteering as well, Piers, because of the nature of the roles you do maps quite closely to the things you do professionally as well. It's a topic we've not really talked about in some of the other podcasts, but this whole idea of high-skilled volunteering, it's a particular interest in the sporting context, I think, when you do have people like trustees and board members that often are bringing skills from their day job into the sporting context. And it's maybe it's another one we should stick on our list, Imo, for another area to explore sometime in the future, that one.
Yeah, but I also think, Piers, it'd be really interesting to understand how you balance that passion and profession, because do they conflict at some points, or do they always complement each other?
If I answer that firstly, I think volunteering has changed. I think if I look back to the 90s, when I probably first started volunteering, and I look to what we're looking for in a volunteer now, times have changed, and I think it's a good thing that it's professionalized. I think you used to get people who used to sit on boards or committees of national governing bodies when I first started out, and they tended to be people who were retired. They tended to be people who had been involved in some way, shape, or form throughout their career, but have now got more time. Whereas I look now, and the number of skills matrices I have to fill out now is testament to the fact that we've now changed, and we're now thinking about the skills that we want rather than just the person that happens to be there. And I think that that's good as well, because we're never going to shift away from politics, but a lot of those volunteers that operate on boards and subcommittees are now selected, and we go through a proper professional process. I'm passionate in the day job about selecting people in the right way and selection assessment being fair and open. I chaired a board of a fair recruiter, whereby this is one of the key things we want to do for volunteers and professionals. It shouldn't be a separate system. So I think we are starting to do that, but I don't think there yet. I think a lot of boards do think, well, we need somebody in marketing, so we'll just go out and find somebody in marketing. Or alternatively, we think, well, it's a volunteer role, so we don't really need to go through a professional process, or we won't invest in that. So the number of times I've seen governing bodies say, well, we're going to spend thousands of pounds on our chief exec recruitment, but I'm not prepared to spend any money at all because they're volunteers, bring in NEDs or trustees. That's wrong, but we are changing that.
You don't want care to list the governing bodies that was, Piers?
This is not what the podcast is about.
No.
This is about collaboration to change the future for the better.
I think it's a really interesting one. Again, when you're looking at the volunteering where there is a specific set of skills required, investment in that volunteering is really interesting. But then my counter to that is, how do you balance the formal and the informal? Because obviously there's an element of volunteering that, by its very nature it's informal. And I'm thinking not so much for your highly skilled board positions, but more general volunteering for organizations. How can sport maybe balance that need for warm bodies sometimes just to do things versus the skills required for the job? Is from a leadership standpoint, what's your thinking around that sort of continuum of formal to informal?
I think the key thing that's changed is that there's now an interest from the corporate world, and I use that word loosely, the business world compared to the sport world. There's always this interest, isn't it? The business needs to learn from sport needs to learn from business, whereas actually we learn from each other. And it's about the individuals that come through. I also don't think we look internally. I've grown up with some fantastic people, and they've got skills. They've learned skills over the years, and we almost dismiss them and think, well, we need to go outside and find some external skill set rather than looking internally at some of the volunteers we've already got. I think the way in which we go out and try and find people has also changed. I do think that we start to think around formalizing and professionalizing that process.
Yep.
I was very lucky to have a chair that worked in the police when I was early on in my career. And one of the things that he always used to talk around all the time is if you think about the police and community support officers, they're volunteers, they're walking side by side with a paid professional, but they're both being professional. It's exactly the same. If I sit on a board with paid professional staff, executive, I would expect as a chair, the NEDs and the trustees to be unpaid professional, and the input they give is just as formal, just as professional, and the standards and the quality that we expect from them, it should be exactly the same across the board.
Standards and the expectation of standards as well starts from I agree with that, definitely.
In the spirit of being inclusive, NEDs being non-exec directors, which are often those top board level roles, do you feel that there is a big divide between the approach to volunteering at board level and the reality of volunteering in the community? Or do you think the philosophy and the changes that you talk about are actually happening at both levels?
It's a good question. I think that there are some people that see volunteers in two different ways. They see the volunteer that sits out in the rain in the high vis jacket with the clipboard signing people into a sports event, and then they see the person that sits in the board as a different type of volunteer. So that's a very good question. Is it changing? I think when I started out, there would be committee members that would sit on a board, but also be the person in the car park. We've kind of got almost two different types of people. We've got the parent or the person in the community that wants to help out because it's a local event or because it's their children involved. And then I think we've got almost a career volunteer who is looking for something to add to their CV. And I don't have a problem with that. But the question I would ask to anybody who's applying for a role on one of the boards that I'm involved with is they've got to want to do it. They've got to want to put the time in, but they've also got to understand the expectation you mentioned before, Chris, which is that we're expecting them to be professional in what they do. And I'm always open and honest from the very start with people who are coming on, because I've done it myself and I know how difficult it is when things get tough.
I think that's interesting as well. I'd be interested. I think Join In did some work a while back around perceptions of volunteers, and I think they found that a lot of parents and whatnot didn't appreciate that trustees and NEDs were actually volunteers. So these people that were, if you will, in charge of the governance of the organisation, they just assumed they were all paid members of staff. And we touched on it on an earlier podcast, where this idea of the commodification of sport, and it's a business, and this idea that everyone's getting paid, everyone's a paid coach, is actually not. It's not very. In fact, it's very rarely true for most people's experience. So certainly a team sport, we're seeing a bit more of it, but it tends to be volunteers are still running through it. But parents don't necessarily always appreciate that it's so volunteer dependent. You don't appreciate that a lot of people are giving up their time for free, and maybe that's a job for sport to be better members and participants. I don't know.
I think when I started out, and I'll go towards the beginning of my career because I think sports changed. But if I go back to early on in my career, it's changed the kind of volunteer that we bring in, the kind of people that we're looking for, but also the kind of people who are now attracted to sport and to national governing bodies. I think the London Olympics had a lot to help sport to grow and develop in that way. Commonwealth, probably, if we all of us were involved in that. We go back to 2002, blimey, that's years ago. But if we think about the kind of people that now we're looking for, we are starting to engage with recruitment companies to be able to find NEDs and trustees, that we are professionalizing the process. We are looking for different skill sets. And I think that people do start to understand that. I've done both paid and volunteer board roles, for example. And the role is exactly the same. It's, are you passionate about the charity that you're involved with? I think people understand that charities, you don't tend to be, or you're not paid compared to being an NED on a national governing body, which is a business at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think we do have to think about that. There's an argument, isn't there, that if you go out to people who are prepared to do something in return for pay, you're going to get a better quality of people. I don't subscribe to that.
Yeah.
However, it does professionalize the system. You should be able to say the same thing about an NED as you say about somebody that you're bringing in as a coach or a part-time coach. Why on earth would you not, if you can support it and you can pay it? But I don't necessarily subscribe to the fact that you have to.
You mentioned the Olympics, and it's one of my little questions here. Obviously, Sport England in the last couple of weeks have taken a bit of a thumping around on one of the cross-parliamentary groups, saying that there's not been an increase in participation post 2012. And why is that the case? Because you like you mentioned, there has been significant changes in sport in that period, and there has been some real positive for people that work in it. There is some really positive things going on, but why are we not seeing that reflected in the broader participation? And what role can volunteers play in potentially broadening and growing that participation?
I think early on, I saw almost a backlash in volunteering. When national governing bodies performance programs started to get funding from UK Sport and an increase from Sport England, and back in the day, sports partnerships and the excellent work that Sue Campbell did around with the Youth Sport Trust.
Yeah.
We almost saw a backlash, or I felt a backlash from some of the volunteers I work with, which is, well, we've now got professional staff, so I don't need to get involved in this anymore. That was sort of earlier on. I'd like to think we're through that. I'm not going to come on here and come up with a panacea to our participation ills, but I also don't think it's as bad as we're making out. And I also, quite frankly, I think that we're focusing in very much on something very specific.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do my job as a chair of UK Deaf Sport and a trustee of the Activity Alliance without mentioning the fact that we've got to recognise the fact that disability and disabled people have real access problems within sport and physical activity. And so to me, it's a no-brainer. And we're lucky because, of course, we've got Tim Hollingsworth with his background with Paralympics GB. He understands that. He's a disability ambassador. he gets that, and I can see Sport England shifting and understanding that, and I can see us tackling that a bit better. But that's one example of where I think the Paralympics was fantastic in 2012 because we raised the profile, and I think that people are more aware. But over the last decade, that's the one thing that we haven't done, which is to solve that access problem.
Yeah.
And if we honed right in on that tackling inequalities, but we also looked at the volunteer recruitment changes that you talked about earlier, do you see any difference in how volunteers are being recruited in kind of different areas? Or what do you feel, knowing what you know from UK Deaf Sport, that we can do to really drive that positive change?
UK Deaf Sport is a bit unique because if I look at the diversity of the board, it's something that I'm not happy with. The board isn't happy with. We need to change. But let's just set it into context. We've got to think of skills on the one hand. We've got to make sure we've got the right people to match to our strategy, which when I first joined, we didn't. We just, anyone that was prepared to give up time, we would have grabbed with open arms. But we're now in a position whereby there is more interest, and that's a good thing. We're getting an interest from people from far wider than the deaf community. But I've got to consider as chair that we've got to have a diverse board. We've got to make sure we consider all protected characteristics, and we've got to make sure, and of which there are plenty, we've got to make sure that we have a majority of deaf people on the board. But we've also got to then subset what does deaf mean, because I have a hearing loss. I'm deaf, but I use hearing aids, and I can understand in a different way to somebody who signs, who is a very different person from somebody who wears a cochlear implant. There are different approaches. So I've now got to consider all of those, as well as, have we got enough deaf people? Have we got enough different protected characteristics? I then focus in on what's the diversity of thought that we've got? Have we got the right skills that are in? Are we considering a diverse and a fair board? And when we have a recruitment process, which we do, is it fair? Is it anonymized? Is it focused on the skills that we're asking rather than a CV, which is very 1986? Are we focused on the interviews that are asking the right questions about the skills that we're looking for? And then the outcome of that is that we are starting to get a much more diverse board. So that it works. We know it works. So why isn't everyone doing that? Why do we still see adverts now for national governing body volunteers to be on a board? Send your CV and cover letter in.
And a bit of a pet peeve with that. They're still advertising in the same sort of trade journals. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And then you invite your mates because you can see the CV and you can see who it is, and I'm sure I'd do it. It's bias ridden. So that's a real problem that we've got, and I think sport has changed so much for the good in terms of professionalizing our boards and our subcommittees and the people who help out. We have to grasp that. We can't keep going back to opening out and saying, okay, well, it's the same people all the time. And I'm one of those. Look, I sit on all of these boards because people tapped me on the shoulder and said, would you be interested in?
But do you think, so the journey of people working in sport used to very much be the traditional sport development route. You'd work out, you'd be a sport development officer, you'd then go through the ranks and work within your national governing body. That's a very big stereotype, sweeping statement, but I definitely feel the journey I've been on has observed that with my colleagues. But where you talk about the diverse recruitment in volunteering and at board level, it definitely feels like sports are realizing they need that diversity of thought from different kind of roles that are paid, but also to complement and support the roles that are volunteers. But that feels like quite a big shift, and how and we're still trying to kind of like storm norm reform into this new world of really welcoming, embracing difference and diversity of thought at every level in all roles.
I do think it has changed. I think I'm not seeing the same old people sitting on the boards. There used to be a time when, and I'm very lucky because I think I went to my early career was in such a trajectory that I started to be asked to sit on boards quite early on in my career. I've seen a difference. I've seen a difference in the people who sit on those boards, who turn up to those kind of meetings. I used to turn up to UK Sport or Sport England meetings, and it would be exactly the same people, no matter what no matter what it was. Or back in the CCPR days, the SRA days, we would go to those
kind of meetings as well. And yeah, you are right. There it was old boys' day out, where they'd all go and have a sandwich and a cup of tea together and catch up, as they did the circuit around the various organisations. So yeah,
And I do think that's changed now.
Yeah.
I don't, and that's a good thing.
No, I think you are definitely right about that. With your sort of with your UK deaf sport hat on, as an organisation, less more on the leadership side now, as more as an organisation recruiting volunteers within your community. Tell us a little bit about sort of how that's discussed at a board level. How do you think about that strategically for the organisation in terms of growing your volunteer base and making sure it is all the things we've talked about here for the sort of the good of the sport?
One of the, and I'm making UK Deaf Sport sound like it's the only one who deals with this, but if British Blind Sport would have the same, in fact, a lot of the national disability sports organisations will have this. One of the benefits is that we have such a tight-knit community. In fact, we have pockets of tight-knit community. We'll have the BSL community, the signing community. We'll have other pockets of deaf clubs that are fantastic at spreading the word. Where we've failed is that we've not understood we've just tried to deal with the deaf community as a whole, rather than sort of understand how we can use in the right way and how we can communicate in the right way. And of course, we have to communicate in different ways because there are different. English isn't the first language for a lot of the people that we work with. So how we communicate and how we bring people in is really important. I think UK Deaf Sports had the same thing. As we professionalised, we've gone through the same process I mentioned before, which is that volunteers turn their backs when they think they're a professional staff. Where you would have had 10 volunteers doing an incredible amount of work, you bring in one person as a paid employee, and those 10 turn their back. So it's trying to keep people involved. I went to the FA Disability Cup, where the FA did a fantastic job of bringing in support for the Deaf FA Cup. And there were lots of volunteers there who were from the FA, who were paid, lots of volunteers along with paid staff, a lot of people who came from the deaf community. And it's a fantastic event. That's what we've got to do more of. How do we develop volunteering through? I'm convinced, as you two know, that we do that through clubs or we do that through events. There's got to be a thing, there's got to be an entity that we work towards. And then how do we capture those people to go through? Chris, as you know, the after effects of the Commonwealth Games are that we had people that wanted to volunteer, that we could then have a database that we could then speak to.
Manchester one of the things building on that legacy all these years later, 20 years later.
Exactly. And what we've got to do with UK Deaf Sport specifically is to tap into that and make sure that there's a strand of things like that, databases like that, that have deaf people that are prepared to be able to give their time to be able to help. But I would say there's a real focus, quite rightly. If I'm deaf, I want to volunteer for a deaf event. UK Deaf Sport have got to look to how do we run those events and how do we support those events and bring more volunteers in to help.
And how do you get that balance between engaging volunteers who have lived experiences and possibly feel that they're very passionate about that cause because of their own lives, but also the training, awareness and understanding of people that don't have lived experiences around that, but do want to help contribute and learn? Do you have resources that help volunteer involvement to develop people who don't have as much experience with kind of operating with deaf events and that side of things, to help almost how they might approach their clubs, and if someone who's deaf and wants to go into mainstream opportunities?
Yeah, we do. We have deaf awareness training, but one of the things that I feel passionate about is you can always have training, you can always have EDI training. The best thing you can possibly do is to put yourself next to someone who's got lived experience and to be able to understand it. But also what we're doing there is we're shining the light solely on the deaf person and not on two volunteers. I go back to the police example beforehand. There's enough to learn from both. I think we use the phrase serial volunteer in a negative way. There are some people I know who have retired who want to give their time, and they are very professional. They come from a very professional career. And I would suggest that if somebody is deaf, has lived experience and wants to get involved, and they're stood next to somebody who has lived experience of volunteering and can bring some skills, that's a two-way conversation, not a one-way.
Yeah, I
Definitely.
very much agree with that. Yeah. In terms of your work then with the FA, your leadership work there, again, football is the biggest volunteer sport. It's the biggest sport, full stop. The Premier League is the pinnacle of that. Where does volunteering sit in the thinking of the Premier League? Is it in there? Is it in the thinking? Does it play a role? Do they appreciate the sort of the foundations that volunteers lay to enable sort of that pinnacle to exist? Just, I'm intrigued as to, at the higher echelons of these organisations, is there an appreciation of the sweat and toil that's gone on underneath it to make it all happen? I guess.
I mean, I can't speak for some of the clubs, but certainly everything that I hear from the clubs, from the community, one of the things that I think clubs are very good at doing is to be able to understand their local community. And I know that the three of us could come up with several organisations that we've worked with that work it that are Premier League clubs that will be able to do that, and EFL clubs that work well. There's no sport, it's irrelevant of the size. Just because football is a big sport and a popular sport doesn't mean to say that you don't have volunteers. Just because it's huge in terms of the money that people talk about doesn't mean you don't need volunteers. If you're running a smaller competition and you're running a huge football competition like the Premier League does, you still need volunteers. You still need volunteers within clubs. You still need people who are paid professionals working alongside volunteers who are professional in what they do. You're going to have that, right? My role touches on the workforce, but we focus very much on the workforce within academies, on the leadership of academies, and certainly those academy leaders that I speak to are acutely aware of the volunteer coaches that they have, especially in smaller EFL clubs. They're acutely aware of the fact they have volunteer coaches. They have people that drive minibuses. In fact, a lot of them in smaller clubs find that they're doing a lot of work with volunteers. So I think it does depend, but there's no sport that can survive without people who are volunteers that give their time to be able to help to develop it.
Kind of moving back to your very extensive list of different kind of sports that you work with and organisations, but also picking up on this tension that often exists between paid roles and volunteers. Is there an organisation out there that you think's really smashing it in regards to that mutual value at levels from grassroots to board, really working together with volunteers for them to have a brilliant experience as well as be delivering brilliant experiences?
I think it'd be unfair to pick out national governing bodies because there are probably quite a few. I do want to go back to actually what I mentioned before, which is that the sports partnership work that Youth Sport Trust did years ago, there are community groups that were connected to that. To me, that was the start. I remember Sue Campbell talking years ago at the Sports Development Conference about this. The principle of using schools as the heartbeat of community sport and bringing volunteers and sports clubs and national governing bodies together to be able to grow around it, because sports facilities weren't going to be used after school hours. What a brilliant concept. But how are we going to scale that? By using volunteers. So if I answer the question by saying, had that have worked, I don't think we'd be talking about select committees asking questions about participation. And I think that national governing bodies would have a tapped into the local community in such a brilliant way, and we'd have better facilities, and we wouldn't be talking about closing swimming pools.
I still haven't heard a better plan since I was at that same conference with you, Piers, and I don't think I've heard a better plan since. Continuing point of frustration for me that it's never quite been cracked, that model of civic participation through the existing community structures rather than it all being sort of separate and disparate and the school being the heart of that. It's I think Steve Granger also has a really interesting saying from when he was at the Sport Trust was, if all the professional staff don't turn up on Monday morning, the sport will still take place. The game of rugby will still take place the following Sunday. If no one at the RF Youth comes in all week, the games will still take place the following weekend. The professionals sort of, it needs to be remembered all the time what they're doing it for, if that makes sense. It's their reason to be there isn't necessarily their job per se, but it's for that the good of the sport. And it's difficult sometimes to not get caught up in the fact you've got your things to do as part of your job, but to bet that overarching remembering that it is about the game on a Sunday afternoon for the kids playing, or whoever happens to, that's what it's fundamentally about. So,
if you go back to Imo's point about the tension before, and you mentioned the tension there, that's the issue though. That I go back to that example I gave before about two people working side by side. Being pro volunteering doesn't mean professional paid staff bashing.
No.
And I know that's not what you're suggesting, but nobody loves an NGB. But the people who turn up to an AGM tend to be volunteers. They tend to be people who are passionate about it. But all they want to see is, and in the same way that people will bash the government whilst they're in, because they don't perhaps see some of the additional things that you've got to consider. One of the things that I will say delicately is that I can turn up as a volunteer, and I don't like the fact that other people say this, but I can turn up as a volunteer at 9 o'clock and work through till 5 o'clock, and I can walk away. Whereas the professional staff do have to think about some of the wider issues, and you and I know that there's an awful lot going on there as well. So where I want to see volunteering go in the future is that we absolutely understand both sides. And there's as you say, you can't run a sport as big as football or as small as, I'm not going to name small sports and patronize them, but you can't run sport without volunteers.
Call them niche instead of small.
The way we want to go, and the reason why I mentioned the school sport partnerships, is because how you bring together the local community, the national governing bodies, the clubs, the professional coaches, the volunteer coaches, the facilities, and the participants from cradle to grave. That to me is how it works. And when we say we've not cracked it, the three of us know we've cracked it. That's it. That's the model that we have to work for, and that also helps us with our talent pathway.
But I think there's opportunity. So I feel like, one, I am just going to declare, I feel like in quite a nervous position being from a national governing body, and absolutely try not to ask you loaded questions to say netball, Piers. I am not doing that in any way at all.
Ask away.
No, and I'm moving away from those questions. But I am really interested in this staff volunteer kind of piece and that mutual value. And I'm quite passionate about it as well, because I feel like, it is relationships at the end of the day, great operating relationships between people who really understand what roles and responsibilities they're doing, and they value each other. And I think the vision for volunteering that's come out is almost, and maybe I'm young and naive, because I feel like when CCPR was around, I was only starting out. Like,
you're naive, did you say?
You two, you two have got more years on me. Like maybe
you're naive. You're what a naive.
I don't know. I did say very funny. But I feel like the vision for volunteering, encouraging this collaboration, and we talked about the business world and the sport world, but what we haven't talked around is the charity sector. And I think charities are brilliant in volunteer management and nurturing people to understand the core principles around volunteer involvement, experience, engagement, and that side of things. And I think that's where sport's being nurtured to collaborate more. Street games are organisations that are operating in kind of like, community areas, and the school sports partnerships are huge, and schools are central to that. But I think there are other community organisations where experimentation and collaboration is starting to happen, but needs to happen more consistently, because there's that causal element of volunteers there that are probably also volunteering in sport, and we're making their lives difficult by making it, like, A, not fun, because it feels like it's quite admin heavy, and B, kind of just, it's part of your life rather than feeling in addition to, and another thing that you've got to do. It's actually something you want to do and you enjoy doing. And I think sometimes we lose the fun in volunteering. I don't know whether you feel the same, or how the organisations you are working with are working better with charities.
I think charity and volunteer are two words that people have such bias when they look at it. UK Deaf Sport is a charitable business, but when we are looking for a chief exec, we are looking for somebody with experience of running a business, of being a chief exec. And it doesn't matter whether it was a charity or it was a corporate. At the end of the day, they still have to run it like a business. And what do I mean by that? We are business-like. I don't call our directors trustees. We call them non-exec directors, because we're trying to explain to our community that we're running it effectively, professionally, as a business, like a business. Now, there are plenty of businesses that aren't run well. There are plenty of charities that are run brilliantly. That's not the point. The point is that there's quite a lot of bias around the fact that, well, if I'm working as a volunteer, on a charity board, it's kind of something I do in my spare time. But I'm on a business board as a non-exec director, and that's part of my portfolio career. And I don't think that's fair, and that's right, and that's just. And I don't think that's fair as a presumption or bias on charities and on volunteers.
Just sort of circling back as well slightly, because one of the strands in the vision for volunteering is this concept of power. And I think this sort of comes back to some of the things we've talked about here, that when you have a paid member of when you have a paid member of staff versus a volunteer, not versus a volunteer, that's not right, they're not sort of head to head with each other. But just going back to that tension, when someone's paid to do the job versus someone doing it out of their love or their whatever their motivation might be, the power difference, and that, like you say, nobody likes a governing body because the governing body has the power to give out the punishments and all the other stuff it does. Maybe I don't know, how does a governing body manage that power differential so volunteers don't feel power, so volunteers don't feel excluded, or there's a really interesting interview the other week with Bill Sweeney about his role as the CEO at the rugby union, and he said that's one of the things that he's learned over the last couple of years he's been in that role is, appreciating the power the rugby union has and how you can democratize that more effectively with the volunteers and the organizations and the various people, and the transparency of the goals of the governing body versus the needs of the various individual clubs. And so it's quite an interesting sort of. So just thought I'd get your thoughts around how governing bodies manage that power effectively with a stakeholder group like volunteers.
That's it. That's a very deep question for a Friday afternoon in terms of the power dynamics in national governing bodies. But I challenge that. The power is in the volunteers, not in the paid staff. I'm a chair that is appointed by the membership. The membership is of volunteers predominantly. The people who turn up at the AGM are the ones who are passionate about their sport. They're passionate volunteers. They want to be able to see action, and they treat me like a paid member of staff. They think that I'm in that role and I should be doing a good job. And if I'm not, they're going to get rid of me, and they can get rid of me. If a membership turns up to the AGM and says the sky is green and the grass is blue, they're the membership. It's a democracy. And they can, if they want, there are safeguards in place from a governance perspective. That's the caveat. But even still, if membership really want to do something like that, they can do. And I go back to Bill's point, absolutely. But you mentioned this beforehand. If the staff all disappear, the volunteers are going to carry off running. If you get rid of the volunteers, the paid staff are going to be stood there with the clipboards and the whistles and not knowing what to do with all the equipment. And then the coach loads of kids are going to turn up. What do they do? So I think the power is absolutely in the volunteers' hands, but we shouldn't be talking about who's more powerful. We should be talking about, I go back yet again to that, how do those two people walk side by side, sharing lived experience, sharing that skills, and doing exactly the same job, maybe with different elements of the job, but doing the same job, and they do it in the right way. And every time I've volunteered, I've been next to somebody who's been paid, and we have the same approach every time. And this is, I think, is because it's sport, right? Because the vast majority of people I've worked with in sport are passionate. They want to be there. They ain't there for the money. Well, it depends which sport you're in, but in general, from the national governing bodies I work with, because my career has been built around small startup national governing bodies, the people I work with are passionate. They want to be there. They want to be there, whether they're in a paid role or whether they're in a volunteer role. And you bring those people together. It doesn't matter where the power dynamic lies.
And it's almost like you wrote the vision for volunteering, Piers, because I'm going to read the top 3 lines, and I feel like it's just really important to kind of look for by 2032, under the power, it says people supporting volunteers work alongside them as equals, channeling their interests and passions and supporting them to make change. And I think that's exactly what you're describing, as well as first-hand experience is valued, and the focus is on people's ability to make change, whatever their role. People are supported to move between roles, volunteering, paid work, and accessing services. And I think those are just 2 points from a lot. And I guess it's almost, how do we build the culture that moves us closer to that? Because clearly having that vision, that's needed by 2032 means it's not consistently delivered yet, but that is what we are aspiring. And there are probably some really good pockets of it operating well in places. And who knows, there might be someone that loves their NGB out there.
You can put them in contact with me. That would be nice.
Well, can you let me know if they contact you as a result of this podcast? Because I wouldn't mind knowing what good looks like as well, because that's how we grow, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's the thing. A national governing body makes rules. It has to say no. And a lot of the time, and this is a difficult thing for paid staff, because somebody will say, and I can't abide this, but you will get volunteers who say, well, I'm just a volunteer, and I can't, and I don't operate like that as a volunteer, and I don't like that approach, because the two people who are there side by side are there to be able to operate together, and I want them to be able to communicate in the right way, and I want them to be able to learn from each other. That's one of the things which has come up a lot in this conversation, is how can we learn from each other, that lived experience of, say, being deaf or being disabled, and passing on to somebody who wants to volunteer at the Paralympic World Cup, for example. That's one of the best events that I've seen, because you've got able-bodied volunteers I've seen at a lot of events around Manchester, for example. They turn up at the Paralympic World Cup, and they're working with staff, and they're working with disabled people with lived experience that are getting into volunteering, and it's just a really good community of people. That to me is probably, you talk about where it's worked well, an event that's worked well, absolutely. And I look at the Rugby League World Cup recently, and what we've done there in terms of looking at not only raising the profile of the women's game and the disabled game, but also the volunteers that are wrapped around that. It's absolutely fantastic. So fair play to Chris and John.
On that one, just to sort of support what you said, one of our other clients is the Seashell Trust, who are based just out in Stockport there, and it's a school for children with profound learning difficulties and communication challenges, and they run a summer camp each year, which is very much what you just said there, with a whole range of people that were kids at school that are now volunteering alongside able-bodied volunteers from the local. It's always such a wonderful thing to get involved in. You see these barriers broke down between these two community groups, where you've got, able-bodied kids that haven't really been exposed to children with sort of that level of disability, working alongside kids that were previously at the school, as volunteers. And when it works, it's a wonderful thing. You watch people see the potential in each other and become friends with each other and develop that sort of understanding of each other's lives and the challenges. One of the organisations we're really proud to sort of support. So yeah, we are running out of time, and Imo has a lovely couple of questions to ask you, Piers, to help us close out the pod. Imo, over to you.
Well, it's just this little thing we do at the end, Piers. Don't worry, it's not too painful. It's called Two From You, and it's one word from your professional work and what volunteering kind of means to you in your paid roles, and then one word from your kind of personal world, which is still very professional, of volunteering experience of what volunteering means to you. So 2 words, one from your work experiences and one from your personal journey experiences about what volunteering means to you.
I'd like to cheat and just say it doesn't matter whether it's from paid or my work or my volunteer work, which is passion. I'm a volunteer because I'm passionate about seeing the output. It doesn't mean to say that I'm divided. We spent the whole of this conversation talking about there's no difference. So I feel a little bit of a hypocrite if I then say there's a difference. The passion
ruining your clothes there.
So you're getting 2 for 1 then. 2 for 1. Breaking the mold, Piers. Pioneering.
The only thing I would add to that is passion across the both, but from a volunteer perspective, it's personal. I think one of the benefits of volunteering, and I'm careful not to dismiss what I said earlier about I'm a volunteer and so therefore I can't do it. I can walk away. But I get choice as a volunteer. There are fewer choices in the professional world because it depends on what you're doing and a lot of the frameworks you sit within in the professional world. I choose personally what I do. I give up my time personally because I'm passionate about something. So personal passion, but passion across the two.
Thank you so much, Piers, for giving us an hour on a Friday afternoon. It's
Nice.
really appreciated. It's been lovely to catch up with you as well.
Massive thank you, Piers, and look forward to continuing to change the world a little bit for the better.